Chapter 11, For the Record. The committee overseeing psychic warfare research had already been scheduled to meet in a full hearing to inquire into the cause of the previous deaths of 2 psychics. Now they had a 3rd death on their hands. Understandably, the atmosphere was extremely tense. Viktor did his best to appear in command of himself, although a certain amount of nervousness was expected as a matter of respect. When he was called at last into the small conference room down the hall from the laboratory. It was a closed hearing, with only the 4 Russian army officers present, 2 generals and 2 colonels, as judge and jury. So secret was the subject matter that not even a stenographer was included. The officers made their own notes as the hearing progressed, and, of course, it was all recorded on audiocassettes. Although Viktor had not been consulted in its composition, he knew exactly what Colonel Chernov's written report stated because he had been given a copy late the evening before. It was the usual head-in-sand nonsense that echoed the materialistic line, and it angered Viktor. It would take all of his self-control to go along with it. The new democratization had changed little at this level of operations. He and Dmitri had talked late into the night, and he knew that his friend was right. It would be suicide to attempt to get the committee to understand what he suspected. The only sensible course was to parrot Chernov's report, his supposed findings, which was simply what the colonel knew his superiors wanted to hear. Dialectical materialism was still the controlling ideology, despite exaggerated reports to the contrary. Defending established dogmas was far more important than discovering the truth, even though officially that state of affairs was now denied and relegated to the past. Some things were simply a part of human nature, no matter what regime might be in power and what ideals it might espouse. All of his life under the former Soviet system, Viktor had nourished and suppressed a bitter hatred of the necessity for sheer survival's sake of never expressing one's true opinions. Perpetually torn between hypocrisy or prison, he had always swallowed his pride in the end and opted for the former, though sometimes by the narrowest of margins. And now, under the new freedom, so little had changed. Deep in his heart, he maintained his integrity, and he knew that the day would eventually come when the dam would burst and pour forth a flood of cherished convictions that would send him to prison with his head held high at last. On this occasion, however, Viktor had a preeminent motive for controlling his tongue. His plan depended upon surviving this hearing, a plan that he dared not disclose, at least not yet, even to Dmitri, the one man on the entire base that he trusted. Customarily, only one witness was called in at a time, and no discussion between witnesses of any testimony was permitted outside the hearing. No one working in the lab was to know what anyone else had testified. Viktor waited in the corridor for more than 2 hours while Chernov made his presentation before the committee. As the colonel exited and Viktor entered, neither man looked at the other. That was customary, an indication that there was no collusion between them. Even the slightest change in expression, the interplay of a glance, could be cause for suspicion. Viktor came to attention in front of General Nikolai Gorky, the steely-eyed chairman. Seated to his right, behind the same slightly raised table, was General Aliev. To Gorky's left sat the 2 colonels, Ostapenko and Ludsky. There was no attempt to set him at ease. Upon the shoulders of these men lay the responsibility of preparing the Russian Republic for the deadliest warfare ever conceived, a responsibility that they carried with the utmost solemnity. The only man in Russia who fully comprehended what they were involved with was the FSB director himself. There was no room for error, and anything at that secret base that was the least out of line had to be dealt with harshly and immediately. Viktor knew by experience that he was just a pawn on the chessboard. Like all the others, including Colonel Chernoff, he was a man who knew far too much. His survival depended solely upon his ability to continue to produce what was vital to the program. If he ever failed in that, he would end up somewhere in the gulag, if they decided to let him live at all. He also knew that by now the unbending superiors he faced had already come to their conclusions based upon Chernoff's bull-headed input, and he must not say anything that would rock their boat. He had survived this ordeal 4 times before and was determined to do it again. General Gorky was shuffling through some papers and barely acknowledged Viktor's presence when he entered. Finally, he found what he wanted and looked up to stare Viktor coldly in the eye. "Dr. Koryev, the autopsy declares cardiac arrest to be the cause of death in both cases, and now in the third as well. We all understand that the type of experiments these men were involved in, so-called out-of-body journeys for the purpose of intelligence gathering, puts a great strain on the heart. Were there any warning signs to alert you? If not, why not? And if so, why did you not stop the procedure in time?" "Sir, as you know," began Viktor, choosing his words carefully, "my medical assistant, Dr. Shevchenko, who was present during all of our experiments, was brought into the program 2 years ago because of his many years of experience as a cardiac expert and surgeon. He detected no sign to indicate an imminent heart attack in any of the subjects, nor could he find any indication after carefully going over the graphs with me several times since. We simply had no warning that anything was wrong, and thus there was no way we could have aborted the process in time to save the lives of these men comrades who were very close to me and so important to what we were all dedicated to accomplish." "Then how can you explain what happened?" "I have asked Dr. Shevchenko, and he has no explanation. He was giving first priority to establishing additional safeguards, but he has come up with nothing as yet. We will keep working on that, but I think we all recognize by now that these experiments are extremely dangerous." Gorky turned to his colleagues. "Does anyone have any further questions regarding the matter of medical procedures and safeguards?" The 3 officers shook their heads. "Now we come to something far more serious, something that is not discussed in the official report given to you by Colonel Chernoff last night. He has informed this committee that you made some reference to gods. We are assuming that that was in jest, but that you were not jesting when you stated to him that we were being warned not to proceed with this program. I view that statement with great concern. What do you have to say for yourself?" Viktor drew a quick breath. "Of course, I was not serious about the gods. While I presume Colonel Chernoff recognized that, I admit it was an ill-advised remark. I'm afraid also that my other statements to the colonel may have been hasty." "Hasty in what regard?" "Well, there could be other explanations. I may have been overreacting under the stress of the occasion. I can tell you that what we witnessed yesterday was not only awesome but terrifying, as I think the others who were present will all testify." "You didn't answer my question. Hasty in what regard?" "I expressed an opinion about the meaning of the message that was given under the stress of the moment and had not been carefully thought out to a conclusion." "Have you come to that conclusion by now?" "No, sir, I have not. Death to Prometheus does seem to be a warning. Its exact meaning, however, remains a mystery, which may indeed be the intent." General Aliev had been shifting in his chair restlessly and drumming his fingers on the table as if to show his impatience with the lack of progress. He interrupted at this point. "There has been a consistent pattern to these so-called messages. Is that not true? For one thing, each has been signed by Archon. You are responsible, Dr. Koryev, to determine their source and also their meaning. This committee is waiting to hear something substantive from you. Instead, you've given us nothing but vague apologies." "If you took a poll of the leading Russian psychologists," replied Viktor quickly, "I'm certain the consensus would be that the source of these messages has to be the deep unconscious of each psychic. That 3 different individuals have, in their deaths, given us messages that are so consistent in content must be attributed to the collective unconscious that is shared by all members of the race. The consistency in the presentation of the messages can also be explained on the same basis, which is why I would personally consider this to be the only possible theory." Colonel Ludsky was shuffling loudly through some papers in an apparent show of disapproval, and Colonel Ostapenko had cleared his throat, shoved his chair back, and turned his head several times toward General Gorky. As for Gorky, his steely eyes were staring with unblinking intensity into Viktor's. Determined to keep his train of thought and not be unnerved, Viktor pushed on with his explanation. "In the altered state of consciousness, that, as you know, is the only way we know of for engaging in these experiments, the subconscious mind controls the motor muscles. This often results in what has been called automatic writing. In each case—" "We're familiar with the mechanics," interrupted General Aliev impatiently. "What we must know is the interpretation of the message." "I'm leading up to that, General," responded Viktor respectfully. "To make an interpretation, it is important to consider the source, which is why I gave such a lengthy explanation to support my belief that the subconscious is the culprit, at least by all the indications." "Such as what?" demanded Aliev. Viktor was troubled, wondering why the general seemed to be resisting the very explanation he had been so certain they wanted to hear. There was no way of knowing what Aliev or the others might have had in mind if it weren't the materialistic line, and Viktor did not dare to change his planned response. This could be a trap, an attempt to encourage him to betray himself. For one thing, we have in each case a reference to Greek mythology. Viktor was doing his best to seem relaxed and sincere. There must be no indication that the questioning was bothering him. "Yesterday, for example, it was Prometheus, a figure that could indicate a subconscious fear on the part of Yakov that he was treading on dangerous ground. Many Russian psychologists agree with the theory of Carl Jung that the collective unconscious is rich with primitive memories embodied in archetypes, some of which have become the substance of mythology. It would be entirely consistent with this theory to expect the very kinds of messages that we have been receiving. The interpretation, then—" Gorky cut him off. "Doctor, you don't seem to understand our concern. What General Aliev is saying is this. We have been getting messages from some source telling us not to proceed. Is that not the case?" "Yes, sir." "Now, who would most benefit if we shut down our research?" Viktor was stunned by the unexpected direction the questioning had taken, but did his best not to betray his emotions. "The Americans, I suppose," he replied cautiously, "but I don't—" Gorky cut him off again, and his tone hardened. 3 of our best psychics die while probing what we believe is an American intelligence installation doing advanced research similar to our own. Doesn't that tell you something, Doctor?" "I don't think the Americans have the capability." "You don't think? You don't think? Opinions are useless. We need facts. Your job is to figure out how they do it and stop them." "We've been doing our best, General, to discover their methods through psychic probes, but I don't see how we can continue our present approach. Don't we have agents abroad who can penetrate their organizations?" "That has nothing to do with this hearing," Gorky reminded him coldly. "Your laboratory has its own reasons for existence and its specific assignments. Are you suggesting that, in fact, it has no function that is different from agents abroad, and that we shut it down?" "No, sir, I'm not suggesting that. I understand your point, and we were doing our best to fulfill our function, but we seem to have confronted a force that is beyond our present capabilities." "Precisely," returned Gorky, "and that is the intolerable state of affairs that this hearing is intended to address and to resolve. The general hesitated for a moment, as though uncertain whether something ought to be mentioned, then proceeded. The felt pen with which Yakov wrote the message is of American make. Such a pen is not easily available in Russia. How did Yakov obtain it? I had never seen it before, nor had anyone in the laboratory. I would swear it was not there prior to the incident. Gorky held up the pen in question. You, Dmitri, and Pyotr personally observed Yakov writing with his pen? Yes, sir, and with his left hand. He happens to be right-handed, and I've never known him even to attempt to write with his left. Of course, in a trance, anything is possible. I don't think anyone puts much importance in that, Doctor. It's the pen we want to get straight. It's an American pen, interjected General Aliev. Not German, not French or English, but American. Of course, Viktor added thoughtfully, going along completely now. He was psychically in America at the time this occurred. We don't even know what such astral projection involves. Conceivably, something from America somehow became psychically attached to him and appeared in the lab at the time he suddenly came back into his body. Can we be sure he came back? Gorky asked sharply. What does Dr. Shevchenko say? He does not know, sir. I'm afraid that the unknowns outnumber the knowns when it comes to out-of-body travel. Gorky turned to Aliev. You wanted to say something else, General? We're dealing with a force, declared Aliev grimly, that could make the atomic bomb look primitive. If the Americans win the race to control psychic power, that's the end. We have been assured for years that American scientists ridicule psychic power, that their government spends very little on such research, and that we are far ahead in the race, so far ahead that they can never catch us. That no longer seems to be the case, and you, Koryev, will have to shoulder the blame. This is a sudden turn that has come only in the past few weeks. Viktor was reeling now. He had been so confident that he could weather this procedure. I would not have risked Yakov, believe me, but I understood that the committee insisted upon it. You had another plan? Asked Aliev derisively. Why didn't you tell us? Of course, he couldn't tell the committee that they were stubborn, mulish fools who discouraged any genuine exchange of ideas, but he wanted to. Oh, how he wanted to do just that. I don't have a plan at the moment, and until we do, I don't think it's wise to make another attempt of this nature. We have a plan, interrupted General Gorky. Tomorrow you fly to Paris for the opening of the First International Congress on Parapsychology. There will be some additions to your delegation. Everyone, including you, will be under the command of General, who will pose as your assistant. There must be no hint that you are not really in charge of the delegation in your public appearances together. Is that clear? Yes, sir, responded Viktor quickly, relieved to know that he was still to be allowed to leave for the West. That was essential to his own plan, or was it a dream that he'd been going over carefully for several months? I've drafted a statement which you will include in your address to the Congress, continued Gorky. It calls for strict controls on the use of psychic power and for the free exchange of research findings. Your assignment is to see to it that this resolution is adopted. And I expect you to come back with an invitation for you and 2 assistants to visit the CIA's California installation. In turn, you will invite Dr. Frank Layton to visit you here. Gorky turned to his fellow officers. If no one else has anything further to add... Sir, the medical report, Colonel Lutsky reminded him. Indeed, one more question, Koryev. To Viktor's relief, Gorky's tone was no longer threatening. Your report seems to suggest that Yakov died prior to writing the message. Obviously impossible, is it not? That was an oversight, sir. Colonel Chernov had already pointed out to me the obvious fact that the monitors had malfunctioned before Yakov was ripped from the controls. And once the wires had been torn from him, of course, we no longer had any means of determining exactly when he died. In that case, we can only go by common sense, and I heartily concur. The report will be rewritten and the records corrected, sir.